if you want to check your FB later. Okay?
It should make it more open,
So,
flexible, and
there.
less burdensome for new businesses and investments. Meanwhile, the business sector should assist its workers adapt to the demands of modern technologies through retraining, on-the-job training, and mentoring and coaching programs. Both the government and the private sector should work together to create an environment that fosters and embraces innovation.
So once again, good morning and welcome to the public symposium on Rethinking Regulations in the era of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, organized by the Philippine Institute for Development Studies.
Mathematics and incorporating both cognitive
Yes.
and
By the way, I'm your MC for today. I'm Rowena Taliping from the PIDS. And before we formally start our event, let's all stand up for the national anthem. Sorry, we do not have our flag, but we can just imagine that we have one. Okay.
Mga kababayan, ang pambansang awit ng Pilipinas.
You may now take your seats. Okay. Today, we are honored to have with us distinguished guests and high-ranking officials from different sectors. So to formally open our symposium, may we call on our President, Dr. Celia Reyes, for her welcome remarks.
Good morning, everyone. So we're very pleased to see all of our friends here. First, let me acknowledge some of our very distinguished guests. Of course, we have Dr. Bill Maloney. We have Mr. George Chua, the President of the Federation of Philippine Industries. Of course, we have our ASEC, Carlos Bernardo Abad Santos. I just call him Kaloy. That's why, and I think he's Kaloy to most of us. From NEDA. And then Dr. Sam Chitik, our country representative from the Asia Foundation. ASEC Mirna Chua from DBM. We have Attorney Josephine Santiago, our Director General from the Intellectual Property Office of the Philippines. And of course, we have Joselito De Vera, our friend from Philippine National Volunteer Service Coordinating Agency, and also Ms. Suzette Manilay from the National Project Support Consultant. So to our speakers, distinguished guests, partners from different sectors, colleagues from the government, and friends from the media, good morning to all of you. On behalf of the Philippine Institute for Development Studies, I would like to thank everyone for joining us in this public symposium. As some of you might remember, we had our annual Public Policy Conference, or APPC, in this same hotel last September as part of the PIDS-led Development Policy Research Month. Not only was it well attended, but most importantly, we were able to gain insights and unpack the issues related to the Fourth Industrial Revolution, which we call FIRE. This symposium is a sequel of the APPC, which centered on the theme Harnessing the Fourth Industrial Revolution, Creating Our Future Today, to highlight the profound impacts of digital and technological revolutions in the Philippine landscape and how we Filipinos can make them work to our advantage, especially in making growth more sustainable and inclusive, while at the same time adjusting to the disruptions and potential negative impacts of emerging technologies through appropriate policy interventions. This symposium underscores the importance of revisiting regulations in light of today's fast-evolving scientific and technological advances, which are not only creating new products and services, but also reshaping our industries and challenging existing regulatory frameworks. We need to take a closer look at the regulatory impacts of fire on key sectors like transport, health, and finance. For instance, in the case of big data, what regulations should be in place to safeguard personal information and privacy? For new transport business models, how can we ensure consumer welfare, fair business competition, and income sustainability for the operators? The participants that we invited to this symposium come from different sectors: government, industry and private sector, academia and research, and civil society. This quadruple helix approach is perhaps the approach that we need today to tackle the complex regulatory challenges that we are facing. We can no longer work in silos. We need to bring together multidisciplinary viewpoints in an open, collegial environment that promotes cooperation and collaboration. In the words of Chris Brokert of the World Economic Forum and Victoria Espinel of the Software Alliance, what is needed is a new era of agile governance, policy making that is adaptive, human-centered, inclusive and sustainable, which acknowledges that policy development is no longer limited to governments, but rather is an increasingly multi-stakeholder effort. Majority of our participants today, however, are from the government sector. We structured the forum this way to involve more government agencies because we believe that the government should play a proactive role in ensuring that FIRE is working to our advantage. As what Socioeconomic Planning Secretary Ernesto Pernia emphasized during the last APPC in September, it's important to redefine the role of government in the FIRE into one that encourages innovation and productivity. Today, we will hear from various speakers from the finance, transportation, and health sectors about new technologies and innovations that they have developed or are currently developing in response to the demands of FIRE and how Filipinos can benefit from them. We will also learn more about the challenges that they're facing, particularly in the area of regulations. In the afternoon, we will learn from government regulators about their current and planned strategies and approaches to address innovation-related regulatory issues, as well as the challenges they are facing. We need to hear both sides to get a complete picture of the opportunities and challenges that come along with FIRE, and how government, industry, academia, and civil society can work together to come up with relevant and evidence-informed policies. But before all of this, we will have the privilege of listening to the expert view of our keynote speaker, Dr. William Maloney of the World Bank, on what he and his co-author call as the innovation paradox and what can be done to redress it. I hope that this symposium will be a venue for us to discuss the next steps and ways forward so that all of us can harness the benefits of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Thank you and have a good day.
May we also acknowledge the presence of DOST's Undersecretary Carol Yorobe and Dr. Alfredo Pascual, the CEO of the Institute of Corporate Director. Thank you so much for that, Ma'am Cel. Now, at this point, allow me to introduce to you our keynote speaker for today. He is the Chief Economist for Equitable Growth, Finance, and Institutions in the World Bank Group. Prior to that, he was Chief Economist for Trade and Competitiveness and Global Lead on Innovation and Productivity. Before working at the World Bank, he was a professor of economics at the University of Illinois before joining the office of the chief economist for Latin America. He was also lead economist in the Development Economics Research Group and taught at the University of the Andes, where he worked closely with the Colombian government on innovation and firm upgrading issues. He received his PhD in economics from the University of California, Berkeley, and his Bachelor of Arts from the Harvard University. He has also published in academic journals on issues related to international trade and finance, developing country labor markets, and innovation and growth, as well as several flagship publications of the Latin American division of the bank. Ladies and gentlemen, we are deeply honored to have with us today Dr. William Maloney.
Well, thank you all so very much for the invitation to speak with you today. It's my first time in the Philippines, and so far it's been a really excellent experience. Vic assures me I'll be back, so thank you all very much. I'd like to thank Celia for her kind organization of this, and for Sheila for her persistence in getting me here. My assistant, Marie Charity Quiros, a proud Filipina, said, you know, Bill, you really have to go. So between she and Vic, I am here. So I want to talk today a little bit about a project that we finished last year on what we call the innovation paradox. The picture is by a Spanish-Mexican surrealist artist named Remedios Varo, and it's called The Creation of Birds. And we'll come back to why I have that on the cover as we go along. But first, let's talk for a second about what we're talking about with innovation. It's very clear when we're talking about high-tech stuff, iPhones, okay, we're being inventive, and new products are coming on the market, and all sorts of exciting, shiny gadgets are coming along. I consider part of my job at the World Bank as chief economist to make innovation boring, in the sense that innovation is any introduction of a new business process or a new product or a new way of doing things that increases productivity or increases welfare. So most definitely we're talking about improving the productivity of businesses. We know we have a frontier of technologies that are available that the frontier countries have invented recently or long ago that developing countries can bring to their businesses and improve. But it's also the case, for instance, that in agriculture, fairly small innovations, for instance, when I was in the Mekong Delta in Vietnam, I visited the An Giang Plant Protection League. And they've managed to work with tiny rice farmers, very small, less than half a hectare, in introducing a scientific application of the correct pesticides, appropriate seed varieties, and other ways of reducing risk in the business process through locking them into a value chain that increased incomes of these poor Mekong farmers by 100% in 1 year. It's not sexy, it's not an iPhone, but it changes the lives of these people. Similarly, just talking with Phoebe, she's introducing new technologies through the telephone to link people up with information on health, and in turn convey the information on the drugs they're consuming and the drugs they're demanding in an easy to read, easy to digest form to the government. Okay? It's not sexy like an iPhone, but it's incredibly important. So as we go, as we consider innovation, try to keep your mind broad about what we're talking about. It's not, it goes beyond the iPhone. This is part of what we call, this is kind of an awkward situation. I have this professorial, right, nope, it's not so much that as I have this professorial instinct to point at things. And I have a little dance routine here. So this is the first volume in what we're calling the World Bank Productivity Project, called the Innovation Paradox. And the second one we just finished, called Productivity Revisited, which looks at the last 15 to 20 years of literature on how we should be thinking about and measuring productivity. And technically, you can think of what I'm going to talk about today as nested in that overall framework of how to improve productivity. And I'm going to actually take the productivity angle more than some of the other things, for instance, delivery of social services that we were just talking about. The next volume is about to come out on high growth firms. The one after that is on agricultural productivity, and the one after that will be on regional disparities in productivity. So stay tuned. Okay, I want to start with productivity growth. What is productivity growth? It's like using the same amount of money you're spending on machinery and labor, you're getting more output and higher quality output. And it gives you, it's what in the end contributes to the value added of your economy and drives growth. Half of the changes in growth through history, through all countries, is due to productivity growth, something we can't explain. And historically, everyone knows that this has been incredibly important. Ibn Khaldun, perhaps the first economist, in 1377, sitting there in Cordoba, Spain, said civilization and its well-being, as well as business prosperity, depend on productivity. Okay, he set a pretty high bar there, okay? This is the well-being of civilization depends on productivity. And once you see that, then Paul Krugman's productivity isn't everything, but in the long run, it's almost everything. Just seems kind of like a ripoff 500 years later. But you get the point. This is, for the Philippine economy, fundamentally, this is the big source of growth, okay? And this is where you really have to focus on going forward. Now, productivity growth can be easily decomposed in an algebraic way, which we will not bore ourselves with, into three basic components. The first component is the reallocation of factors of production away from less productive firms to more productive firms. Okay? And you can, in theory, get a very big kick out of this. If you have, for instance, bad regulations or obstacles or firms that dominate a sector that prevent taking resources away from me and giving them to VIX, whose firm is much more productive, then that prevents an increment in productivity growth that you could have taken advantage of. And that has been the focus of the literature over pretty much the last 20 years. But there's a second way, which is just within existing firms, improving their productivity, improving the quality of what they produce, improving the way in which they produce it. And then the third is increasing the quality of entering firms. These can be domestic firms, young, smart young people who are saying, oh, I can do this better than the existing firms in the market, or it can be foreign direct investment coming in. That's saying, okay, I can offer you a new set of technologies to help solve this particular production problem by setting up a plant here. You can immediately see that these entry and exit issues relate very much to the theme of this conference, because if people find it incredibly hard to function in a regulatory environment, they won't come here, right? So how much is attributable to each? I can't, I would go over and show it in each case, but what I want you to take, this is some calculations we did for this recent book, and what you can see, the orange and the blue and the red and the green correspond to different amounts, and what I want to say is that it depends in different countries on different times, but we cannot ignore any dimension of this. Reallocation can be very important. For instance, in India, which I think is second from the left, or third from the left, reallocation was very important during their period of trade liberalization, as old firms that were very inefficient got killed, and new firms moved in to take some of those resources. That's a very important story. In other places, however, for instance, half of China's growth has been within firm upgrading, okay? So, and I would say in the Philippines, it's a very mature economy, you're going to be having to deal on all of these fronts. And when you think of the regulatory structure you're building, you're going to want to have it friendly to all three kinds of upgrading. Okay, so I want to highlight two broad, and just in following on what I was just saying, I want to focus on two broad factors which drive these. And so you see that first blue line at the top, that's what I call the operating environment. This is where firms, the environment in which firms operate. And so this gets into all these issues of regulation, business climate, market failures, the lack of existence of credit markets, or the inability to move things through a clean trade or trade institutions or any of those things. And those, I think, very much correspond to what we're talking about today. The second set of things, though, I also want on your agenda, because we have to work on both. And this is what I call human capital and innovative capacity. And this, you can just think, supposing the Philippines were to get, okay, Singapore, totally clean, everything's perfectly ordered and well thought out and blah, 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 blah. But there's nobody with the human capital to actually identify an idea from the frontier and say, I can make that work in the Philippines. I can bring that to my firm. And then to have the managerial capabilities to actually implement it, right? If you don't have that, then it doesn't matter how clean your environment is. So we have to work on both fronts about that, about getting good entrepreneurs to work in an environment that facilitates productivity growth. This capacity is both to adopt new technologies, and that's mostly what I'm going to focus on today, but also to invent. I can just look here. Okay, so I want to give you a historical example. And this maybe will resonate more with you than with the Japanese who I presented to yesterday, because these countries I'm talking about actually share a historical commonality with the Philippines. So this is a graph that on the x-axis has GDP per capita in 1900. Vic will tell you I love history, and I think history has a lot to teach us. But what you can see is that where that red line is, there are a bunch of countries that had more or less similar levels of income in 1900. So we had Chile, Argentina, the US South, Canada, Sweden, and Denmark. All those countries had more or less the same level of income in 1900. But there's a huge difference along the y-axis, along this vertical axis. And what that is, that's the number of engineers per 100,000 male workers. And to me, the number of domestically trained engineers per capita, effectively, gives you some measure of the innovative capacity, exactly this capacity to identify a new idea and adapt it to the local context, all right? And what you see is all of Latin America. So we can, the US North is about 160, the north of the United States. The United States overall is about 100. Sweden and Denmark was about 100. But then all of Latin America and Spain are under 20. Okay, this means that all of Latin America and Spain and Portugal went into the second phase of the Industrial Revolution basically unarmed. All the new technologies in metallurgy, in chemistry, all of these things, they couldn't identify, they couldn't plug into, and they definitely couldn't adapt. And what impact did that have? Well, for instance, we can just look at the mining industry for a second. And I choose the mining industry for a purpose, because all the talk about the natural resource curse makes us often think that there's something intrinsically bad about exporting copper. And in this case, Chile in 1860 was the world's largest producer of copper. But by 1900, the domestic industry was dead. And they concluded that there's no future for copper in Chile. Obviously, that's wrong, because copper is now 50% of imports and of exports and 10% of GDP in Chile, and it's the second or third largest exporter in the world. Nonetheless, at the time, it was dead. It wasn't really dead, because US and British companies were able to come in and apply new technologies and resuscitate and push the copper industry to the frontier. But the Chileans couldn't do it, and the Mexicans couldn't do it. And this not only affected the mining industry per se, and by the way, made them technologically dependent. So the dependency theory, a lot of it comes out of this technological dependency that we don't talk enough about. But it also delayed their industrialization, and I'll tell you why. Take the United States case, where we had the exact opposite thing happen. We developed institutions like Berkeley, which started as a mining university, my alma mater. Columbia University started partly as a mining university. And we developed a network of expertise in chemistry and metallurgy and the like that allowed us not only to dominate these Latin American mines, but it also laid the foundation for subsequent industrialization of the country, because we became leader in these fields, which were important subsequently. But it's not only that. Japan, which we always think as a manufacturing export miracle, in fact, in 1860 was the second largest exporter of copper. And out of their ability to adapt new technologies came at least two firms you've heard of. One is Fujitsu, which was a copper company and became a computer company, and also Sumitomo, which became a major banking conglomerate. So next time someone says, oh, you got to get out of natural resources, it's not what you do, it's not what you're producing, it's how you're producing it. And the how you're producing part is exactly this ability to adopt, to identify and adopt technologies to your local context. That is the story that how I view the Asian growth experience, was this ability to massively, to adopt technologies at a massively fast rate and to enable this catch up to the frontier. And that's what we've seen in, for instance, the cases of Korea, Taiwan, and the little tigers. Okay, so, skip that. So, just to give you an economist quantification of the importance of this, the recent estimates of the returns to investments in one kind of investment in R&D, in innovation, R&D, are incredibly high. Now, why am I talking about R&D here? Because when Phoebe identifies a new technology abroad, she's got to bring it to the Philippines and adapt it to the local context, right? And that requires some R&D, right? And the returns to that R&D are incredibly high. In the United States, they're about 57%. Anybody here from the Ministry of Transport? Infrastructure? What's the rate of return to an infrastructure project? It's not 57%. And if the Ministry of Agriculture were here, the returns to primary education are 57% either. Okay, so if we believe these numbers, and I more or less believe the 57% at this point, it's been quite well done for the United States, we should just shut down all the other ministries, because this is where the action is, okay? But it's not only that, because the ability to identify, to catch up, adds a little extra. This 70% is when the United States is at the frontier, investing in these, Apple, these frontier technologies would take a huge amount of investment to get, small increases in competitiveness and new products and all. But we don't have to do that in the Philippines, because a lot of this stuff is already on the shelf. We just have to go out and say, that would be good for us in agriculture, that would be good for us here, let's bring it, That's all we have to do. And as a result, the return to a marginal peso in R&D should be higher. And in fact, the best studies we have from Griffith, Redding, and Van Reenen suggest that as you get a little further from the frontier, that's the UK, and a little bit further from the frontier in Italy, these returns rise from 77 to 88%. But then, so you can keep extrapolating out of sample, and by the time you get to these countries like the Philippines, you're talking, what, 200%? Oh, now you really should close down the other ministries. As Nobel Prize winner Robert Lucas said, how can policymakers really think of anything else? This is really what we should be thinking of. And in fact, if you were to do a back of the envelope calculation, just take half of growth is productivity growth, and a large chunk of that is exactly this adoption of technologies. Take Chinese growth of 10% per year for 30 years, and take half of that. The value of that, which is a transfer from north to south effectively in existing technologies, dwarfs anything the World Bank can even talk about. Okay? So we should stop talking about multilaterals as sources of funds and just say, how can we get the Philippines to be adopting technologies more rapidly? Because that is where the bacon is. Okay, and here's the paradox. I've just told you the rates of return to this in developing countries should be much higher than in the advanced countries, but in almost every measure of innovation that we have, and they all have major fatal flaws, it's the reverse. This is R&D, and we see, on the x-axis, on the lower axis there, that's distance from the technological frontier, and you see that it's the rich countries that do all the R&D, and poor countries do very little. Okay, looking in detail, I still have the Argentina graph there, sorry. But again, you see that moving closer to the frontier to the right, you get, it's the Koreans, the Finlands, the Japans that are doing massive amounts of R&D. All right, so we don't have to be talking about doing high-tech R&D. This is just licensing of foreign technologies. Identify a technology, and you may have to pay to use it. Fine, but again, we find even in this limited sample that we have here that again, rich countries are doing all the borrowing. And here's something else that I just want to put on the table, because this is important, and we have to start socializing this in the business community, because they're always in a state of denial about this. But management and organizational capabilities are a technology. Okay? So the way in which you organize your firm, how you plan your time horizon, how you manage your HR, all of these are things that need to be learned. Neoclassical economics, which some of us learned, will say, oh no, there's just a production function, you put in K and L, and out it comes. No, that production function is a human, okay? And that human could be very good, but in most of the developing world, they're pretty bad. I worked in Colombia with SMEs, decent-sized firms, 200 employees, whatever. And these were people who were very intelligent and very committed to their firms, and they just didn't know what they were doing, and there's no way they were going to do any serious R&D. So this is the World Management Survey, which is done by, it's a joint Harvard, MIT, Stanford initiative, and they're just measuring across countries management quality. And what you find is that, again, it's the rich countries that have very good management quality. And that's sort of to be expected. But on the other hand, if you really want firms to be saying, I want to go abroad and find out what those technologies are. Well, they need to be people who can do it and who are organized enough to do it and then bring it. This is something that we need to be focusing on too, and I'll talk a little bit more about it later. This is also, since we're government, many of us are government functioning in this area, this is kind of key. Because if we just say, okay, our innovation policy, we want our firms to do more R&D, let's just borrow the US way of doing it, which is R&D subsidies or tax write-offs. What's going to happen if your firms are not able to really put together an innovation project? Well, they'll say, oh, yeah, we'll take the R&D subsidy. And they come in, and Bill puts on a white coat, and yes, Bill is doing tremendously innovative work here. He's pushing on a string, okay? If you don't have firm capabilities, you will not get anything going. Okay, so this is the paradox. Given the returns, why don't firms and governments invest a lot more in R&D? And in fact, when you think of the Asian miracles, they exactly said, we have to do this. But the question is, why doesn't the rest of the world do that? And I think part of the reason that we don't close down all the other ministries in the country is because your Minister of Finance says, well, I honestly don't think that if I give Vic Pacquiao $5 million for a research project, that I'm going to see 200% rates of return. I just don't believe it. And in fact, that's what we see. This is that Malaysia? What is that at the top? I forget which one I have there. Can't even see it. Doesn't matter. But these are the rates, the estimated rates of return to R&D that we calculated moving from the frontier. And you see they do go up exactly as we were talking about before, Italy, Great Britain, blah, blah. But after a while they turn down. Why should that be? We're getting farther from the frontier. There's more potential for catch-up. Why do the returns turn down? And this is where I think this conference becomes very important, because we have to think about, well, is this really what's going to happen? So I give Vic this $5 million, and he's incredibly smart. So he invents a fantastic idea. All right, so that's a good start. Most of our client countries don't actually have that many good researchers who are going to generate this. But then Vic says, okay, now I have to monetize this to push up the Philippines' GDP. Yeah, except that we rank like very low on the ease of starting a new business here in the Philippines, okay? So Vic says, God, I've been waiting for like 3 years for a permit to do this and that and this. So, I'm losing my edge, and this thing's getting stale, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so the rate of return is starting to fall on his potential project. But then finally he gets one. He finds the right person to talk to. Okay, here's your permit, go ahead. He said, good, okay, now I need to buy some new machinery to implement this new idea. Oh, except he goes to the credit markets, and they're willing to give him a year maturity on that loan. He's about to buy a $200,000 machine. He can't buy that with a 1-year maturity. But around the developing world, that's how credit markets work. If you are not connected, at some very high level, you're not going to get credit for any long period of time. In fact, even countries like Chile, which have done everything supposedly so right, many SMEs are facing 90-day rollover kind of credits. Okay, and you just cannot invest in long-term, long gestation projects if that's what you're facing. Okay, so Vic tries, he's got the permits, doesn't have the credit, but let's now suppose he gets the financing. Okay, so he's about to buy the machine, and then he finds out that in customs, it's going to take him 6 months, and actually he can't buy that machine because somebody's brother produces something kind of similar to that machine in Mindanao, and that really shouldn't you be supporting Philippine industry? And Vic says, yeah, but okay, that's not going to work with the same technology. This is going to kill my productivity. It's like, oh, sorry, that's the way it is. Okay, so, all right. But then somebody clears that up, and he can import exactly what he wants, and then he goes and he tries to recruit the engineers he needs to staff his machinery, and guess what? The human capital is so incredibly low that he can't find the workers he needs with capable. Okay, so I've just given you, when I say missing complementary factors, this is what I'm talking about. And it's a very important point that when we talk about innovation, there's a tendency to say, well, there's the ordinary economy, and then there's the innovation up here. No. Innovation can be seen as a form of accumulation of knowledge. In the same way we accumulate capital or accumulate human capital, whatever, it's just accumulating knowledge, right? And so anything that gets in the way of accumulation is going to get in the way of innovation. And I've just given you a whole bunch of reasons that's going to be really hard for Vic to accumulate and monetize that innovation that we need. So this is why, and if any of you have ever worked in Africa or something like that, it's like, R&D subsidies are going to do nothing here. And in fact, that's why for many countries it's negative, because they're giving R&D subsidies when they should be working on primary education. So this is our solution to the innovation paradox. Broadly speaking, as you get further from the frontier, the potential rates of return to go up, but the complexity, all the things that need to be in order for you to actually realize those high rates of return become harder and harder to get in order. And so here's a way of looking at it. And this is an ugly graph. The colors aren't bad, but I do want to make a couple key points with it because I think this framework is very important. When I go to Vietnam and they start talking about innovation, it's like, oh, yes, 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 Hanoi University, we have a nanoelectronic. No. That's not where I want to start with you. Let's start at the right-hand side here, okay? That's demand. When I said this is accumulation of knowledge capital, somebody's going to want to accumulate it. Someone's going to want to take this, expand in some direction, right? And to start with, at the very top there, we have incentives to accumulate. That's how stable your macro context is. That's how competitive your environment is. Can I actually enter a market, or is some long-established state-owned enterprise going to make sure that I can get a foothold? Is the trade regime open so I can actually export? Are these opportunities there that would create a demand to innovate? And then the second thing here is, do my firms have the capabilities in terms of management quality, in terms of technological ability, to actually implement that? So that's the demand side. And I would urge you to start there when you talk about innovation, because around the world, innovation gets lobbed in the science and technology wing of the government, and all those resources go to universities, which may or may not be doing something useful for the private sector, probably a lot more poetry than engineering, and it never gets to the private sector. And we're very concerned that you want to be getting this demand in order. On the left-hand side, exactly, we have the supply, all the stuff you need, education, science and technology programs, all that sort of stuff is there. And in between are all the barriers to accumulating all kinds of factors of production, including knowledge capital. And that includes the credit markets, barriers to entry and exit I was talking about, the business and regulatory climate that we're talking about, and the rule of law. All of these things, which we don't normally think, well, no, that's Google up there, that's innovation up there. No. This is average SMEs trying to adopt a new technology that will increase their productivity, and they can't do it because of some regulatory barrier. Really unsexy stuff we're talking about. But this is the action. I assure you, in the developing countries around the world that I have visited, that is not, the key is not in the nanotechnology department of Hanoi University. The key is getting entrepreneurs who can actually function and take advantage of things, and then moving the barriers to them doing so. So the implications are, first of all, that our concept of a national innovation system has to be much broader than it is, for instance, the United States or Sweden or wherever, because they're just dealing with the market failures associated with innovation. And those are commonly, for instance, what we call appropriation externalities. For instance, Vic goes abroad, comes up with a fantastic idea, he brings it back here, and I copy it. And I need to do it in his market right away so he doesn't get the full returns from his investment. That's why we have patents. Right? Those are the market failures the advanced countries are dealing with. And that's still all important, but obviously we need to be considering all these other barriers to accumulation of knowledge. We also need to reconsider how we benchmark innovation, because it's very common for the World Bank to come and tell you, well, Korea is investing 4% of GDP in R&D, and the Philippines is under 1%, so you really need to increase your R&D. It's like, maybe. But it really depends on this, how your other factors of production are aligned. There's just no reason that Haiti should be doing any R&D. I can almost assure you that, because they don't have any of the other ducks lined up. So more is not necessarily better, and so we have to be a little bit careful. And that's a World Economic Forum, the World Bank, all of us got to change the chip a little on that. And the other thing is that firm capabilities are critical complementary factors, and we focus a lot on them in the report. And I just want to flip through. How am I on time? Yeah? And where am I now? Yeah. Okay, you flag me when I have 10 minutes, okay? Okay. So a lot of the analytics we've done is just to show that, in fact, these basic abilities to organize a firm and along the ways that we think are very common are actually critical to innovating. So for instance, this graph shows on the x-axis the quintile of management quality of firms. We just put all the firms in different bins depending on how good their measured management quality is. And you see that better firms do more patenting, better firms do more R&D. And in fact, we've demonstrated various things. First of all, management quality increases productivity directly. So you put it with R&D and all the other things that we think increase productivity, it has an independent effect, and it's an important effect that I'll come back to. It also, management quality increases patenting, which in the end goes into productivity, and increases R&D, and it increases the effectiveness of that R&D. So it affects the whole, so this means it's an integral part of the process, and we have to think about how good it is. I have a rough idea, probably given the level of income, of how firms are here. We haven't done a study for this. We could talk to your local World Bank office and say we'd like to see that. It's actually very useful, because around Latin America, I don't know if you remember the previous graph, but Latin America kind of in the middle. And I go to the association of firms and I say, look, the numbers we've got show that you're in the middle of the pack, even for your really advanced firms. And they say, no, that can't be. We're Chile. We're the Chilean miracle. We must be awesome. No, you're not. Okay? You are really low on this. And you go to Argentina, but we have the highest human capital. How can this be that we're so low? Look, I don't know. But the fact is you're low. And so it's very useful to start getting the private sector to be a little less complacent about where they are. No, I'll leave this. What drives management quality? Well, first of all, it's not just more competition trimming the left tails. In fact, it's moving the entire distribution, and this is exactly what I was getting to. It's not just that the worst firms are really bad. It's even the best firms lag a lot. In fact, in China, it's very interesting. Thank you. Perfect. In China, it's interesting because the bottom decile of firms in China is actually about as bad as the bottom decile of firms relative to the frontier in the UK. Not so bad. But it's the best ones that really are bad. And that probably has a lot to do with the fact that those firms are going to be state-owned enterprises, and they have a lot of objectives besides maximizing profits. Hello. So you got to move the whole distribution. And the determinants are more competition, better human capital, things like rule of law. Often you will find, why, for instance, do we have so many family-owned firms throughout the developing world? And in some cases, like Korean Air, it may actually be very useful for their long-run growth, but in many cases we find that family-owned firms are just badly run, because instead of giving it to an outside manager, allocating management to an outside manager or something like that, you give it to your not very bright son. Now, why do you do that? Well, if the regulatory structure, if the property rights or the rule of law structure is not so good, so that I worry that if I hand my firm over to Vic, I'm not sure what he's going to do, and if he misbehaves, I'm not sure I can get it back. Okay, that shows up in our data very clearly. So again, sort of regulatory environment, how easy it is for me to resolve those kinds of conflicts, how much trust there is, confidence in the government, all these things are very important for the ownership structure, which in turn feeds back into productivity. Trade, participation in GVCs, very useful, because you plug into Toyota's value chain, they're going to upgrade you. But you got to get up to the level where you can already play with them. And for instance, in Vietnam right now, that's their problem. They have lots of multinationals, but they're not good enough to play with them. So for instance, Samsung outsources all of its parts back to Korea instead of locally sourcing them in Vietnam. So I'm going to go quickly through this. Obviously, I've kind of set up what we call the innovation policy dilemma, which is that for developing countries, we have many more market failures, many more distortions to work on in order to really take advantage of this possibility of arbitraging technologies from the frontier. And yet at the same time, our government capabilities are correspondingly weaker. And that makes it the problem of taking advantage of innovation really difficult. And so what we do in the book is to try to lay out some good practices and principles in design and implementation. And we developed something called the capabilities escalator, which I'll discuss in a second, which is designed to kind of reduce the dimensionality of this problem so that policymakers can get a grab on it. So the first thing is actually getting down and dirty with why you are implementing an innovation policy. It is incredibly common to say, Sweden has these institutions, let's bring them to Colombia. Okay? And then you have a bunch of boxes on the organogram, and they're populated by, friends of friends of friends who are doing nothing for the private sector, because that really wasn't the problem to begin with. And the problems of Sweden are very different from the problems of Colombia. So just getting our innovation experts in the country to say, okay, I'm going to talk to some of these SMEs, and they're going to tell me they got tax problems. Fine. They always put taxes as the first thing. But then, once you get down below, it might be that the credit markets are not functioning, and what you need to do is help them upgrade their management quality and provide access one way, they simulate credit markets that will give them 3-year access to credit. But just getting down and dirty and not getting exotic, what's keeping our firms from innovating? The efficacy of implementation requires a simultaneous effort improving government productivity and improving government efficacy. And this includes the usual things like capacity building, stuff like that, but it also means installing evaluation do loops in the process. So we go in and try something out. If it doesn't work, we kill it. Okay? But that whole evaluation loop becomes very important. Coherence of policies across the national innovation system. It's like everywhere I go, there are at least 5 agencies that subsidize patents in countries with GDP of $2,000 per capita. It's like, why are there 5? How much money is being spent on it? You find there's tremendous fragmentation because the political economy over time has generated all these different ministries with an interest in having a foot in the innovation game. We've come up with something called the Innovation Public Expenditure Review for Science and Technology, which sits down mid-level bureaucrats and says, okay, let's talk about where our flow of resources is going, and where they're going is really where they should go. It's usually the case that the mid-level bureaucrats are very cooperative and say, yeah, this is really stupid, you should do this, we shouldn't be doing this. And then you get to the ministerial levels, like, no, I'm keeping that. So it's usually actually the big cheeses who stand in the way of reform there. But this is very important, and I think the IPER is a good tool to get the discussion going. Policy, consistency, and predictability over time. In Latin America is very common. President comes in, innovation, big thing. Next year it's the peace process. Next year it's reaching the agriculture. Like, no, the Chinese do not make this mistake. The Chinese say we are catching up to the US technologically in 25 years, and they do not deviate from that plan for those 25 years. So policy coherence over time is critical. So quickly, policies to lift innovation capabilities, teaching birds to fly. Now you understand the picture. We have something called the capabilities escalator, which basically discusses how you want to get firms into a system where they can see how good or bad they are, and then provide them the basic Kaizen 5S, if you want to use the Japanese technologies terms for these things, so that they can become better. And some of those you will realize are actually very good and can go to another level where they'd be more technologically able to identify new technologies and bring them. And finally, at the top, you'll actually be doing inventing. But in this whole thing, in terms of public policy, you first want the supporting market reforms. You want to get your regulatory environment and all those things in order. But then you're going to want to do some sort of business or export advisory services, technology extension services, and then you get sort of technology parks that solve particular problems for firms. And then you get your, then you get your Silicon Valley stuff. And obviously, there's always some part of the economy is way ahead of the rest. Yeah, okay, fine. We're not saying it's one size fits all. But nonetheless, let's be honest about what we're doing. And focus, and for most of us, a lot of the problem is actually at this bottom, the bottom of the thing. The Japanese did this really well. We all think, the Japanese chose the right sectors, and okay. The Japanese in World War II realized that they had a major problem with quality and the organization and management quality, and they set up this Japanese Management Association during the war. And after the war, they set up 2 more: the Japanese Productivity Center and the Union of Japanese Scientists. Which focused on the quality. So all this stuff about quality circles and stuff like that came out of their own need to reduce their productivity, their 5-to-1 productivity gap with the United States. Then you also have the Japanese Industrial Standards Committee. And they all, collectively, they came up with the Kaizen 5S, all these things we've heard of. But what I want to stress is this was a key element in the Japanese high growth thing. It's exactly developing these birds who could actually adopt new technologies and take off. And subsequently, Singapore literally took a page from the Japanese manual when they set up Spring in the 1980s with the exact same goal of making it, because Singaporean firms, they'd invited in all these multinationals, but Singaporean firms were not interacting with them because they were no good. So they exactly borrowed the Japanese technology, and the Japanese set up the institute, and with the idea of raising the level of the Singaporean firms so they could participate in these global value chains. Colombia, they did something similar. It didn't work so well. We can discuss why. But the bottom line is, a lot of countries think this way. It just happened not to be in the Washington Consensus or anything the World Bank has been really pushing, and I think we should. Do these things work? I'll give you one example from India, where they had 20 textile firms, and half of the textile firms they gave Accenture Consulting to benchmark their management quality and then provide them hand-holding to get better. And the other half, okay, we're going to tell you how good you are, but then we're not going to give you the accompanying advisory services. And that the first group you can see is that gold line jumping up there. And the number of good management practices that were adopted was